Welcome to Madlik. My name is Geoffrey Stern, and at Madlik we light a spark or shed some light on a Jewish text or tradition. Along with Rabbi Mintz, we host Madlik Disruptive Torah on Clubhouse every Thursday and share it as the Madlik podcast on your favorite platform. This week's Torah portion is B'Shalach. The Torah declares that the Israelites went out of the land of Egypt, Hamushim, a word related to Hamesh, the number 5. According to many commentators, this word implies that only some of the Israelites left Egypt armed and ready to fight. This is one of the first times that distinctions are made between one set of Jews and another. So as divisions begin to surface within the ranks of the Israelites, we raise our hand to identify and call out the birth of Jewish sectarianism. So join us for High Five. Well, welcome to the Madlik podcast. Rabbi Adam, welcome back from Kuwait. As I said in the introduction, we're going to focus on really one word that many of the commentators have a challenge with, and it has to do with when the Jews came out of Egypt. It's in the first 2 verses of our parsha. So in Exodus 13:17, it says, "Now when Pharaoh let the people go, God did not lead them by the way of the land of the Philistines, although it was nearer. For God said, the people may have a change of heart when they see war and return to Egypt. So God led the people round about by way of the wilderness at the Sea of Reeds. Now the Israelites were up armed, went out of the land of Egypt." So this went up armed out of the land of Egypt is the crux of our question tonight, because the Hebrew is Hamushim alu b'nei Yisrael me'eretz Mitzrayim. And if you look at your standard translation, for instance, the JPS puts a little asterisk and it says the meaning of the Hebrew Hamushim is uncertain. Everett Fox, in his translation, says, armed, Hebrew Hamushim, unclear. He says there are some that even say the possibility of groups of 5 or 50. So it's a word that I think all of us have heard before. If you've even seen a chamsa, which is that iconic hand, you know that Hamesh means 5. And here we have just popped into the verse a word coming from that shoresh, from that root, and everybody is scratching their head. And of course, the flip side of scratching your head, if you're a rabbi, is coming up with an interpretation. So we will be exploring some of those interpretations and seeing where they do lead us. Rashi, who is always our go-to guy, he combines the 2 verses, and we're going to see a lot of that. Obviously, when you study psukim, it should be in context. So he says, because God led them by a circuitous route through the wilderness, he brought it about that they went up from Egypt well provided. So there's a certain logic, and at one level, Hamushim, which comes from the word hand, you can make the case it means armed, which is kind of nice. In the English, the word armed is related to the word hand. It's provided for. And he also goes on to say, this verse is written only with the view of making the ear understand, in parentheses, preparing you for later statement that you should not wonder with regard to the war of Amalek. So at the end of our parsha, we have a war with Amalek. How do you fight a war without arms? And finally, he says that the word Hamushim has been used before. He quotes Joshua, and he says, if you recall, there were 2.5 tribes who decided to stay on the other side of the Jordan. And it says, when you pass over the Jordan, you should do so Hamushim armed. So rabbis, what is your sense of Hamushim? It's not actually a word that you can kind of ignore. I mean, it's right in the pasuk. How rare is it that we get a word that really baffles pretty much everybody?
Yeah, I mean, let's start from the beginning. The fact that the word is related to the word Hamesh is what's most interesting about the word. Because the question is, what is the idea of being prepared for battle have to do with the word Hamesh, right? They could have used any word. Why is the word Hamushim? That always interested me.
I mean, I think the English is kind of helpful here because the word armed literally comes from something that you bear in your hand. I mean, I did a Google search.
So, that's interesting if that's true, meaning that's an English phrase. The question is whether the Chumash has the same use of the word armed. That we say that in English, but we don't say that in Hebrew, I don't think. Right?
Yeah. And that's why you get variations like Rashi kind of, he talks about arm, but he also talks about being provided for. You look up in Google, for instance, handshaking. And in Wikipedia, it says people would shake hands to make sure the other person wasn't armed. It is kind of natural when you get arrested, when you hold up your hands to show that you're unarmed. So I think it's more than just linguistic. I really do think that in a world where people are fearful for their lives, the way most animals are, their ears perk up. They want to know if someone is a threat or a friend. You look at the hand. So, I mean, it is kind of interesting. It doesn't answer all the questions, but it is fascinating that the rabbis, at least some of them, jump to that kind of a conclusion.
Yeah, it is interesting. I agree with you. That is interesting. I don't know what to make of it, but that's interesting.
So I started by talking about this is the beginning of divisions within the Jewish people. And so Rashi says, and there's another explanation. And he says that he gets away for a second from being armed. And he says Hamushim is only 1 out of 5 went forth from Egypt. 4 parts of the people died during the 3 days of darkness because they were unworthy of being delivered. So here's what I was referring to. And of course, the most interesting part here is if you look at this word, which defies a straightforward translation, and it does become a Rorschach test, what pushed the rabbis to read into it something that would say that not all Jews merited or deserved or chose to leave the land? All of a sudden, for the first time, the birth of a nation, 5 seconds into the birth of the nation, we already have divisions within that nation being imposed upon them.
Yeah, I mean, well, first of all, the idea that 4 out of 5 didn't make it out. That's a wonderful kind of midrash, because that's clearly not what it means, but that the Torah is trying to hint to us something, I think is really fantastic.
Well, we've gotten a few different explanations so far. Why not throw a bunch out there, and then we can start maybe to think in terms of, on the one hand, what the verse means, which I think probably is above our pay scale, seeing as no one has come up with a complete solution. But the other interesting part about it is, how do people react to it? How do rabbis react to it? So the first interesting thing that you pointed out was, it's one thing to say, as I did, that 4/5 stayed in Egypt. Why are we creating these divisions? The next thing is, we're starting to see this trend that we get in the Haggadah also, where you multiply numbers. Because, we all know that the Jews left Egypt. Traditionally, there were 600,000 men, so you figure another 600,000 women, and then you figure children. And so, you think it's maybe 1,200,000, 1,400,000. But if this is the case, think of what those numbers could possibly be. And there are other commentaries like the Rabbeinu Bechaya, who even goes further, and he says it was 1 in 50, it was 1 in 500. It is this also this tendency, I think, to exaggerate, which is kind of interesting, especially because the miracle of 120 1.2 million is a pretty big miracle by itself.
Yes, that is absolutely true. I mean, let's go back to the idea that 4 out of 5 didn't make it. I mean, so you say we're exaggerating, but the exaggeration says something. It really tells you that the Jews were not worthy.
Or that some Jews were not worthy.
But no, but a majority, that's 80% weren't worthy.
That is a big number.
That's a big number. I just want to point out that's a huge number.
And so from that perspective, I guess you could take it in a different direction, and you can say that what it's trying to show is don't ever take this Exodus for granted. A bunch of slaves, few plagues, got out of Egypt, started a nation. Don't ever think that this isn't the most amazing story that has occurred in history. Don't ever think how daunting this was for the participants. You're focusing on the 4/5 that didn't leave. The commentaries are kind of interesting when they focus even on the 1/5 that did leave. They make this connection between God taking them in a circuitous path and giving them arms, and almost in a sense saying, but even though I gave them I gave them the arms, it still didn't happen. It still didn't work. The Sepharno says they did not have the courage to face the Egyptians in combat in spite of their being armed. There's another, Chiba Yetera says, Nafal Libam. So it's almost saying that God did everything in his power to make this happen, but it was amazingly large challenge. And I think from that perspective, that kind of makes me more in awe than any raw numbers.
Yeah, I mean, right. So what you're saying is that the raw numbers, even 80%, could ultimately be misleading.
Yeah. I mean, because you focus on the ones that were left behind and you forget the ones that left, how daunting it was, and how, as much preparation as there was to take a people from slaves and a slave mentality and to give them the ability to stand on their own 2 feet and defend themselves, is something that we should never, kind of take for granted. So that's kind of one of the stories one of the lessons that I take from this. The other interesting thing is, and I mentioned that we were starting to see now different groups. Now we have a group that didn't leave and a group that left. At the end of last week's Parsha, we had the mixed multitude, the Erev Rav. So now we have not only people that left and they were armed and they believed, or at least they were closer to believing than anywhere else, but we also have this mixed multitude, this comes up even later. There's another word for them. They're called the riffraff in Numbers, the asaf safek. There are, all of a sudden we see this is not, the plagues were kind of easy. You had darkness, it was dark for the Egyptians, it was light for the Jews. But now as we get out there, we're starting to see different types of Jews, quasi-Jews, maybe Jews. It's very early in the story, and all of a sudden this is starting to happen to us. And I think that's kind of fascinating. We don't even get a honeymoon.
Yeah, that is an interesting point. The fact that we don't get a honeymoon means it just seems to go from one to the next, right? The question is why we don't get a honeymoon. Why is it? I mean, why didn't God just let everybody out? Why was there this decision to only let out, say, 20% of the people? Means, was it a punishment? What was it about?
So fascinatingly, there are different opinions about what went on. And so one of them is that actually the one of the midrashim, actually it's a pseudo-philo, says that the children of Israel were split in their opinions according to three strategies. For the tribes of Reuben, Yissachar, and Zebulun, and Shimon, they said, "Come, let us cast ourselves into the sea, for it is better for us to die in the water than be killed by our enemies." The tribes of Gad, Asher, Dan, and Naphtali say, "No, let us go back with them. If they are willing to spare our lives, we will serve them." And the tribes of Levi, Judah, Joseph, and Benjamin said, "No, let us go with our weapons and fight." So this becomes kind of fascinating because we, and I am right there, always assumed when 4/5 left behind that they were left behind by God's choice, by Moses' choice. They were rejected. But what this, interestingly, in given the whole arc of Jewish history, suggests that maybe they didn't want to leave. You cannot help but think back to Europe in the 30s, when some Jews were leaving for Israel, Palestine, and others did not want to go. So now we have differences of opinion as to what the right course was. And we're starting to see opinions that, in fact, there is one in our source notes, which I should post, and I'll put them up in a second. There's an amazing article about who were the mixed multitudes, and it's by a professor called Professor Barr. And he makes the case that even some of those who are saying that the Hamushim means groups of 50, he makes the argument that the Erev Rav and these groups of 50 were paid mercenaries. Well, whether they were paid mercenaries or they were fighters is irrelevant in my mind. But what you're seeing is there were those who took charge, those who took the impetus. They even use the words that were later used in Yeshua's time, which I think is a terrible translation. They translate chalutzim as shock troops, but they talk about these armed Hamushim, also referred to as chalutzim, were the ones who decided to leave Egypt. And there were those who did not have enough self-confidence, or, as we would see later, will dream about the flesh pots of Egypt and always want to go back, Datan and Aviram. There were these different groups. And according to this opinion, the Hamushim were a certain type of Jew who led the charge. Not all of them necessarily were armed. It starts to become kind of fascinating.
That is fascinating. Yeah, that is fascinating. I mean, so the question is, so this is really based on what the different explanations of a Hamushim are. If a Hamushim means armed, so the question is, who exactly was armed, right? And where did the Jews get these arms from? V'chamushim alu b'nei Yisrael me'eretz Mitzrayim. Where did Jews get the arms from?
So what's fascinating is, the tradition is, according to all of those who say that Jews were left in, or we should say Israelites were left in Egypt, they were killed during the plague of darkness. That is the tradition. And of course, we also have a tradition that during the plague of darkness, it was pitch black for the Egyptians, but the Jews could see. And there are various traditions that say that the Jews, the Israelites, would go into the houses of the Egyptians and stake out weapons, stake out property that they would later ask for as they left when they were provisioned. We've talked about that before.
Right.
But the interesting thing to me is that in Shemot 10, in Exodus 10, when it talks about the plague of darkness, it says, Lo ra'u ish et achiv. And that one could not see one's fellow. But if you take that metaphorically, again, if this is when the allegory, the myth, the concept of some Jews were left behind comes up in the plague of darkness, it's this division started to occur when one Israelite could not see the other. The division started to occur even within the land of Egypt. So it's almost a recognition of the text that this all began. And I guess, I can't say this hasn't occurred before. When Moses came the day after he killed the slave master, the two Jews said to him, "What are you going to do? You're going to kill us too?" But so there always were divisions. There were divisions in every people, and God for sure there are divisions within the Jewish people. But this is on a much larger scale.
Yes, I think that's right. I mean, I think, and that's what you talked about, the numbers. It makes a difference how many Jews left Egypt in this discussion. What did it look like? And I don't even know what 2 million people leaving Egypt look like, right? What did that look like?
So we get to, I believe, I'm on safe ground to say, that the reason why Hamesh was related, and maybe you don't agree with me on this, but the reason why Hamesh was related to arms was for the same reason that the English word for armaments comes from the word arm. This is where power is exerted. And I think that if you start then to look at the story of the Exodus and look at how Yad is used as a metaphor, it starts also to make sense. I was talking to you before about how I was preparing with my grandson who's going to be bar mitzvahed in a few months, and we were discussing tefillin. And of course, tefillin is first referenced as an ot al yodecha, a sign on your arm, and it references that outstretched arm. And we have to note that the Hebrew word yad, we always talk in terms of a hand, but I think if you look at the text of the Bible, yad can just as easily mean arm as it can mean hand. So now you look at all of the verses that we're very well acquainted with about God outstretching his arm, about the power of the hand of God, and it puts that where it talks about whether it's yad al kesiyah, whether it is the zuor netuyah, the outstretched arm. It is a metaphor for power, for changing, for progress. When it talks about the plagues, in so many of the cases, it talks about raising up the hand. So I think that this is a major kind of part of the story, and it makes us think differently about, what is going on here and what is the power of this chamsa of this hand.
Good. You know what? I'm willing to go with you. I don't know that we could prove it necessarily, but I'm willing to go with you that what we're talking about here is something based on the fact that armaments are related to the hand. I'm good with that. Let's run with that.
Great. So if we look back in the story and we look all the way back to Genesis 41, where Joseph is advising the king, it says, Joseph says to the king, "And let Pharaoh take steps to appoint overseers over the land and organize the land of Egypt in the 7 years of plenty." And there it says, let him make pkidim al haaretz v'chimesh et eretz Mitzrayim. So here Rashi says that they shall prepare, and he says similar to Exodus, and be prepared for war. So now this is another nuance. We talked about provisioning, preparing the Jews that are going to be taken on a circuitous mission. Maybe it takes a little bit away from the military nature of this, but certainly it focuses as Hamesh, as something that is preparing somebody for something. It's interesting that the word comes up, and it's not a word that falls off your tongue easily. Even when you look at that person, at that verse, you need a Rashi to explain what's going on.
Yeah, I think that's right. You mean the simple explanation of the verse doesn't really mean anything, right? I mean, it needs an explanation. I think that's a very smart point. That's a very good point. That I don't know what we're running to we're running to different kinds of explanations. What is the simple explanation is, and I don't know what the simple explanation means.
No, and we probably will not know. But one thing that did come to my mind is that it's strange that while the commentaries do talk about Hamesh as being prepared and being armed, they don't talk so much about being armed by God, which is kind of interesting. And if I had to say one small little chiddush, one small little innovation, in Genesis, where it talks about what we said a second ago, that you should organize the land of Egypt. It uses Hamesh. In Genesis 47, it says, "And Joseph made it into a land law in Egypt, which is still valid, that a fifth should be Pharaoh's. Only the land of priests did not become Pharaoh's." So here, Hamesh, it belongs to Pharaoh. And maybe, and this is my small innovation, Pharaoh was the king, Pharaoh was the god of Egypt. And so it's almost as though the fifth, the Hamesh, the yad, the mover, the shaker, that's what belongs to God. And so it seems to me it's a little strange that the rabbis don't insert God into this Hamesh when the yad of God is all over, but instead use it to look for the differences between some Jews and another. That kind of struck me, especially if my explanation has any salt to it at all.
That's good. So the Yad Chazakah is actually the opposite of a Hamushim, even though it both means the same thing. That's your that's your question, really.
Well, I think that the Hamushim means to be prepared and protected in a very profound way. And if I had to argue from Jewish superstition, from Jewish tradition, if you think of that Hamsa, which people are not sure whether it came from Islam or predated Islam, and it came from Judaism. In our superstitious tradition in Yemen, it's the Yad of Miriam. But the idea is, I've seen pictures of hands, almost, I wouldn't say they were put in blood, but they were put on the wall as a sign of protection. They just recently discovered a hand impregnated into the wall around Jerusalem. This idea of God protecting us with his hand, to me, seems to be where the Jewish people might have taken this concept of God's hand. And from that perspective, it gives a new insight into what God gave these people. They still didn't stand up to the task, but they were appointed by God, they were armed by God, they were prepared by God. That certainly is one way to look at it.
I have a question to ask you.
Yes.
When did they use these armaments that they were prepared with? There's a war with Amalek. At the end of our parsha, there's a war with Amalek. But it's a miraculous war. Moshe raises his hands and they win. Moshe lowers his hands and they lose.
So the Rashi on Exodus 13:18, which I cut short, says that the reason why they have arms is that you should not wonder with regard to the war with Amalek. And then he continues, and the war with Sichon and Og, and Midian.
Good. So that's what I'm saying. It's interesting that the pasuk here says that they're armed, but basically they only use the arms 40 years later.
And I guess once you have your first battle, you can. There's always an explanation of how you got your orbs. You captured them from the enemy.
But I'm saying, isn't that interesting? Means that they were actually preparing to enter the land of Israel. Now, before the sin of the spies, they thought they were entering the land of Israel immediately. So therefore, they needed the arms because they had to fight these battles. And the answer is they didn't fight them for 40 years.
Yeah. So,
right?
Yeah. So the question is, is the answer worse than the question? They're clearly looking at this word and trying to figure out, what it means. But in the Haggadah, we have so many elements that we've kind of touched on today. We have this element of exaggerating, of multiplying the numbers. But to me, the most challenging one is the wicked son. Because it's the wicked son that now takes on a whole new meaning. When they say, you said you, had you been there, you would not have been worthy to ever be redeemed. Now we have a tradition of 4/5 of the people, but let's forget about numbers, about a portion of the people decided or were forced not to be redeemed. And I would argue what makes this fascinating, especially for recent history in terms of the establishment of the state of Israel, where you almost flipped the coin, where it was the God-fearing who, for many reasons, said, we are going to wait to be saved. We will stay in where we are. And it was the chalutzim, and it's amazing that it uses the same word as these forward troops, who were the Hamushim, who went out and had the confidence to create a new land, which just goes to show that, everybody has something, everybody has a lesson to take away from the portion, and everybody should be struggling and bothered by the questions that are raised as we read the weekly portion. And this week is no exception.
I think that's great. We looked at a word, sometimes we look at an idea. Today we looked at a word. It's no question it's the best word in the parsha. It's my favorite word in the parsha. It's one of my favorite words in the Chumash just because I love that Rashi. So we really try to get to the bottom of it. And whether we did or we didn't, we at least had an interesting conversation, something to think about this Shabbat. So wishing everybody a Shabbat Shalom. Enjoy, and we look forward to seeing you next week.
Shabbat Shalom. Great to have you back. High five to you from one street on the Upper West Side to another, and look forward to next week. Well, thank you for listening. And for all of you who listen to this as a podcast, tonight we have an extended version because, as you know, this is recorded on Clubhouse Live. And we have two amazing Hasidic stories from my buddy Yochanan, who is the Rosh Kollel of Clubhouse. And we also have some interesting comments from my buddy Lauren. So you are welcome to leave now. You still get all of your Madlik points and all of the benefits that come with those Madlik points. But if you want to get a sense of what happens on Clubhouse, stay tuned. Yochanan, how are you today?
Hey, rabbis, it's a pleasure to be here. And Rabbi Adam said that Hamushim is his most favorite word in the Chumash. Did I hear correctly?
Yeah, I like that word.
But how is it possible to be differently if Hamushim is actually the same word as Chumash? So obviously this would be
that's funny.
It's
related. That's very good. Geoffrey, that's fantastic. Of course, they're related words.
Exactly. It's actually the same term. It's the same root. It's the same. It's the same word. It's just the difference in the conjugation, what you call it in English.
And
So,
I will say that in my
yeah.
research of the Chamsa, this iconic hand that we see, some of the Sephardic customs is that it represents the Hamesh Chumshei Torah, the 5 books of the Torah, and the same goes for Vehishe Amda, I believe, which is the hay in Vehishe Amda is the hay of the 5 books of Moses, which will save us. So it really, I think, Yochanan, you're just adding another aspect to how these traditions that we've talked about have kind of been recycled and grown and ruminate one with the other. Chumash is a perfect example.
Yeah.
That's
And
great. Thank you very much. Appreciate it. Shabbat shalom, everybody. Enjoy.
Shabbat Shalom, Rabbi. So, Yochanan, how have you been?
I have been great. I mean, I don't know if I was great for myself, but the people definitely enjoyed me this week. We had amazing lectures. Most of them are probably in the replays. There's already scheduled another few interesting ones. You can see in the titles. But I wanted to tell you a story about what you were talking about. You were at one point you were talking about the division that we have among in Judaism, right?
Yes.
And then you were also talking about the that according to some opinions, not all the Israelites left Egypt. There was only a small part, a small percentage that left, and what happened with the rest? They weren't worthy to leave, or they didn't want to leave. And so, according to a midrash, all the rest that were not worthy to leave, they died in the 3 days of the Shloshet Yemei Afela, the 3 days of darkness. They all died because God didn't want them to die when the Egyptians are notified. So that's why they all died in the 3 days of heavy darkness. So and that reminded me a Hasidic story from the 19th century. If you want to hear,
I'd love to hear it.
Like an anecdote. So the Tzanzer Rebbe, who is known as the Divrei Chaim, and so he was the Hasidic leader, but also the rabbi of Tzanz. His children, most of his children, he had many children. Most of his children were rabbis themselves, and also Hasidic leaders. One of them was the rabbi of Gorlitz, and probably you know that in 1869 there was a tremendous inside Hasidic war in Galicia between the Tzanze Hasidim in one hand, the Tzanze Tzaddik in one hand, and in the other hand the Hasidim of the Friedman dynasty, Sadiger, Chartkov, and so on. There were thousands of Hasidim in Galicia, and there were heavy fights, not just morally and polemically, but also physical fights and horrible stories that went on for years. And there are many books written about it. So during the time of this war, one time the Divrei Chaim says to his son, the Godlitzer, he says to him, his name was Baruch, okay? So he says, Baruch, do tshuva ma'ahave and you will be Mashiach. He said to him, if you do tshuva ma'ahave, you can be the Messiah yourself.
If you repent out of love.
Yeah. If you do, yeah. So and the Godlitzer, his son, answered to his father. He answered the Divrei Chaim. He answered him, if he would be the Messiah, okay, the Tzanze Hasidim, maybe they will accept him as the Messiah. But what will be with all the Sadigere Hasidim in Galicia? They hated Tzanz, and they will never accept him as the Mashiach. So what can you do about that? So So his father, the Divrei Chaim, answered him, so nu Burach was Vozoksti. So what do you say about that? So he himself, the son, the Golitzer, he answered his own question, and he said, you know what, Papa, you know what, Father, is going to happen? The same thing that happened in Egypt. There will be 3 days of darkness, and all the wicked Hasidim, all the wicked Sadiger Hasidim, the Hasidim of the Friedman dynasty, who were wicked in the Tzan's lexicon, all these wicked reform, they will all die out, the thousands of them, in the 3 days of darkness, as it happened in Mitzrayim, and that's how he can still be the Messiah, and there will be no contradiction. What do you think about this Hasidic anecdote?
So the first thing that comes to mind is that's quite a way to get consensus, right? You know.
What do you mean?
Well, to destroy the people that disagree with you. The other thing that comes to mind is, and this is the core of what I was thinking about this week as I prepared for this. You know, we have in the end of last week's Parsha and this week's Parsha, if you accept these midrashim that 4/5 or a large number of Jews never made it out of Egypt. So you now have the Erev Rav, this mixed multitude. You have this people that didn't make it out or chose not to leave Egypt. And then you have this Amalek. And the most amazing thing is that if you read these, whether they're Hasidim, whether they're Mitnagdim, but these religious thinkers that are looking to win an argument in the fashion that you just described by either having those people that disagree with them destroyed or disenfranchised, they call the Hasidim and the Haredim till today, I put it in my source sheet, will call the Zionists and people they disagree with Zera Amalek. They will say that not only are they not Jewish, but they are the descendants of our most hyperbolic enemy. And I think that is the real challenge of in these few chapters where we should be celebrating our unity, where we should be celebrating our birth, are all the seeds. And that's what your story does. Your story reaches back into our Parsha when a major disruption is happening, and using it to describe and to condone literally writing off their co-religionists. And I know how terrible it can be, how painful, how hurtful it can be when one Jew says to another, you're not Jewish, or worse yet, you're Zera Amalek, or you're the Sitra Acher. It's just a terrible thing, and I think that if we ever will get to the promised land, it's going to be because we get rid of this terrible, terrible reaction, this just habit that we have of not answering the way we should have in that case, which is, well, I'll forget about tshuva from love. I will reach out in love and convince them, no, they're gonna die in the darkness. It's sad, and it was there right from the beginning.
Yeah. I love so much what you just said, Rabbi Geoffrey, and I have another Hasidic anecdote about the same topic that I'm sure you would love even much more than the first one.
Go for it.
Okay, but this one is not from the Golitzer, and it's not from his father, the Tzanzer, but it's from the Tzanzer's Rebbe, who is known as the Ropshitzer, okay, the Rabbi of Ropshitz. And he quoted this, it says, Vayachnu Shom, when the Israelites came at the mountain of Sinai by Matan Torah. And it says, Vayachnu Shom Yisrael, says the Talmud, and Rashi says, Ki ish echad vayichan Shom Yisrael neged hahar. Rashi says, why is vayichan in singular and not in plural? You remember? So Rashi says, Ki ish echad belev echad. Right?
Yep.
So, and when was this? This happened just right before Matan Torah. So the Ropshitzer said, why did this happen dafka at that point in time? And he answered the reason is very simple. After Matan Torah, it's impossible to be achdus among Jews, ki ish echad belev echad, because every denomination says, my Torah is the real Jewish Torah. My Torah is the real Torah of God, and your Torah is heresy. So it's impossible to have achdus. But the only time when there was a possibility for ki ish echad belev echad was the last minute before the Torah was given, right there at the steps of the Mount Sinai. And that's why it says, Vayichan Shom Yisrael Neged Hahar Ki Ish Echad Belev Echad.
That is absolutely beautiful, and you're absolutely right. I absolutely love it, and it's typically Hasidic, where it's based on real life, and it takes a verse and it takes a Rashi that's kind of saying that, but it really gives it meat. So thank you for that. That's fantastic. Lauren, how are you doing? If you want to raise your hand and come up, we haven't spoken in such a long time. Let me see if I can. Lauren, how are you?
I'm doing well, thank you. I've missed you, but I've enjoyed your sheets and your discussions each week. They've gotten better and better. And so I did have. But by the way, how was your trip in Israel, and what were you there for?
Well, I have family and friends there, but I also run a 100-year-old a charity that was started by Louis Brandeis and Robert Zold and Stephen Weiss that enables U.S. taxpayers to give money to Israeli not-for-profits. So I have the privilege when I go there of driving around the country and meeting people who are making a difference. And if there is one antidote for reading the newspaper and pulling out your hair and saying Israel is going down the drain, it's meeting people out there in the fields that are just going on with business as usual and trying to bring, breach the gap between the educated and the non-educated, the poor and the rich, the people living on the periphery and people living in the center of Israel. And I just come away from that just so inspired. So that's what I was doing. But we had a great trip.
Oh, good. I have a couple of responses to your presentation today. I've experienced, that I'm learning about Judaism, and I'm sort of voraciously attacking it and looking at it from different sources. And this Sarah Amalek is something that's come up in my interactions with a couple of the groups that I've been listening to and trying to participate with, in that if you don't accept their position, you're considered a non-Jew, and it's very hurtful. I never entered that arena before because I never really got down to the nitty-gritty and tried to understand what the various aspects of what the belief was. But they're very protective, and it is hurtful. There's no question about that. The way they disregard people that don't believe exactly what they're espousing.
I think it's divisive. It's, in many sense, racist, and it is absolutely hurtful, and it's a terrible thing. And it has no basis. It has no basis anywhere. But again, I feel that, as someone who I don't consider myself a religious Jew, the reason why I love studying our texts is because it helps us identify and then potentially work out problems that haven't gone away. And this is one certainly that is there and has not gone away and seems to have come up right from the get-go. So, I think it was what Yochanan said was so obvious, which is that I heard it in another way, Yochanan. There is this amazing piece of Mishnah in Pirkei Avot, the Ethics of the Father. And I think it's really talking about the arguments between Beit Shammai and Beit Hillel. And it says, Machloket shehi l'shem shemayim kayam, that an argument that is for the sake of heaven will persevere, will exist. And the way it's normally taken, and I think the way it was meant, was that it will make a lasting impression. It will stand the test of time. But maybe it's a Hasidic interpretation. Maybe it's just a very cynical person who said, no, it's not a blessing. It's a curse. That arguments that are based on religion, they never go away. Argue about something trivial, you'll end up having a beer and hanging out later on. But a machloket l'shem shemayim that is about, as you were saying, Yochanan, about what the Torah says, that never seems to go away. And that's a kind of a warning for those of us who are studying religious texts to say, on the one hand, you almost feel like, so why are we doing this if religion is such a powerful source of division? But on the other hand, I feel, and I think I just said this a second ago, that if we don't then understand religion and identify it and then ultimately harness it, I think that we'll never get away from this. I mean, I think that anyone who's studying diplomacy or political philosophy today should also have a major in religion, because so many of the disagreements throughout the world are based on religion, and you have to ultimately use religion as a lever to solve them. But that's my little soapbox rant.
I think you're 100% right about that. Can I just ask you one last question? I know you're on the way to dinner and you probably finished your scotch. but
go ahead.
You've included the paragraph about the division of the tribes by their intent. And I found that very interesting. Do you, is that commonly accepted in terms of what the motives of the three tribes, of the division between the 12 tribes were, in the way that that's outlined?
I was quoting a very scholarly article, and many of the sources in it I was able to find in Sefaria because they're totally mainstream. That particular source he quotes as pseudo-Philo. So even Philo, who was a Jewish philosopher who really understood most of the Bible as allegorical, this is a pseudo-Philo. We don't even know if Philo wrote it. What gives it value is not who wrote it, but who read it. In other words, it was retained and it was written, and maybe it didn't come up with this explanation, but somehow it persevered, or it preserved, is the word I was looking for, a tradition. But it's the one that divides the Jewish people into three groups. I think it's less important which tribe he associates with which group than the obvious, which is there's one group who just wanted to drop into the sea because they said, I don't see the light at the end of this tunnel. And then there was others who said, let's go back to Egypt. And clearly we hear that refrain throughout the book, throughout the rest of the 5 books of Moses, of the Datan and Avirams who want to go back to the flesh pots of Egypt. And then the third group is this group today that we talk about, which is let's arm ourselves, let's fight against all odds. It's the Nachshon ben Aminadav who puts his foot into the sea, and it parts not because of Moses' prayer, but because of his action. So I just like that part of it, but it's not a highly recognized source. It's kind of out there. A scholar would have to find it, but I did think it shed light on this concept of sectarianism that I was trying to put some light on.
It did. Thank you, and welcome back.
Thank you. Great seeing you guys. Yochanan, sei gesund und stark. Lauren, great seeing you. Shabbat shalom.
Bye. Shabbat shalom.
All
Rabbi.
the best. Bye-bye.